Aloha everyone. Again, today John Marshall, a biological scientist with the USDA Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, will be presenting his research on the forest inventory and analysis in the Hawai'i Experimental Tropical Forest. His research is being done through a permit with the HETF. Please note that permits are required when entering the HETF for research purposes. Okay, awesome. John, whenever you're ready, feel free to take over.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Is the volume good? Awesome. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me here, Olivia and HETF, and thank you all the attendees for listening to me talk the next 40 or so minutes. This is a lot of exciting work, and it involves a lot of people outside of just me. This is a big project. So a little bit of background about me. Grew up in San Francisco Bay Area. Lived there for 20 years or so. Moved to Hawaii for undergrad at Hilo around 2010, late 2010. Stayed here for that. Had some internships with the Park Service. Started working at Haleakala National Park. Got my master's at Manoa in 2016. Worked for the Park Service vegetation management from about 2013 until 2020, kind of in the middle of COVID. And then I transferred to IPIF, where I'm currently located, and a lot of the attendees here are also based out of, which is the, for those of you who don't know, the Institute of Pacific Islands Forestry. Since getting hired in this program, I've been working on land access, mapping support, for FIA, for forest inventory, and then previously with Flint Hughes and Kyson Dunn on Laupähoehoe HETF. But as of about 3 months ago, I'm full-time forest inventory. So yeah, thanks again for having me. Let me just make sure I can switch slides here. There we go. So quick outline. So I'm going to introduce what forest inventory is. It's a national program, so the definition of what FIA is consistent, but it is also place-based. I mean, it does matter where you are doing the work. That's true for all science. I'm going to talk about how FIA plots are measured. Specifically, I'll be talking about the forest inventory project, our most recent measurements effort, which occurred from 2019 to 2022, but I'll also be making comparisons to our original survey in 2010 through about 2015. I'll be looking at some of the FIA plots located within the Hawai'i Experimental Tropical Forest, looking at some of the data that's available, the data that we have now, talking about the data as a whole. Some of it's not ready yet, making some comparisons, and then finally talking about where you can access forest inventory data through our program, the kind of publications that we produce, and then just acknowledging all of the people that make this project possible. So yeah, let's start talking about people. So a couple of these people in this photo are in this call. This is our local Big Island-based data collection team, Kalena, Tish, and Rico. Kalena's still with us. They were with our program from 2019 until 2020. Kalena's still with us. And they read about 400, almost 400 plots in that time. So that's really incredible work and effort that they put into this. But of course, there's more to it than that. We have mainland crews, part of our sort of regional program. My supervisor actually on the left, measuring a koa tree. And one of our quality assessment guys, Seth, doing what looks like kind of a microplot type thing, and some really dense aluhe. We work in pretty intense habitat. This work wouldn't be possible without these people, so I just wanted to give them a quick acknowledgement. So what is FIA? So FIA is a program within the USDA Forest Service. It started in the early 30s, I might get corrected on that, as a timber inventory. So broadly, how many usable board feet can we get out of trees across an area? And that's important too. In 1998, it merged with the National Forest Health Monitoring Program through the USDA, and now it encompasses both goals in one program. And broadly, we're interested in change. I mean, we're interested in discrete data, of course, but we're interested in change across time. And FIA data provides basically trend and status information across the landscape. So it's a landscape ecology project. And that project is made possible by really extensive collaboration with local agencies like the Hawaii Department of Forestry and Wildlife, across the whole country, really, though. It's a lot of this is getting access to land because we have a lot of plots. So it's a large collaborative effort. There's one of our crew members on Oahu and some pretty intense aluhe. So what does FIA data provide? A lot. Again, it's really sort of trend oriented. We're interested in changes in species abundance and patterns, changes in vegetation structure. So if you think of like kind of a cistern kind of dropped on the forest and you cut that cistern like a wedding cake, what's the structure of the forest? We're interested in that kind of information. We're interested in forest health and pathology, forest diseases. Laupähoehoe death comes to mind locally. We're interested in natural disturbance, whether that's wind damage, fire, it's a big one on the mainland, obviously, and animal damage. We're also interested in land use change, and that sometimes means human damage, but also, in an unbiased sense, you know, humans are going to use the land the way that they're going to use it, and we want to just know what's occurring on that land without our plots kind of getting in the way of that. And I'll talk more about that later when we get into this being an unbiased study. We're interested in ownership change. Who owns the land? That has a lot of influence on how the plots are measured and accessed. And then finally, and really importantly, in the context of climate change, we're really interested in above and below ground carbon present in the soil and in the forest biomass itself. So we talk about plots a lot. Well, what is an FIA plot? And it's a roughly acre circle. Within that circle, which is approximately an acre, we have 4 subplots, and those subplots basically capture the vegetation, species present, structure, many other kinds of parameters in those 24 foot subplot radiuses. And that diagram, that sort of triangular diagram, allows us to approximate what's going on in that entire acre. And then more broadly on the landscape, when we have many, many plots, and we'll look at maps in a second, we can use those many plots to make estimations about whole areas, whether those are land parcels or managed areas, or just whole parts of an island. So within those subplots, we have 6.8 foot radius microplots, and those are much more specific rather than cutoffs on tree sizes that we measure. In those microplots, every piece of vegetation is measured. And that gives us a much more fine-grained sense of what's going on in those areas. And yeah, the goal fundamentally is just to have a survey design that is representative of the vegetation in that area and the vegetation dynamics. So, but why, you know, one of the questions I get asked a lot is how are these FIA plots chosen? And it's initially a remote sensing and GIS-based approach where you have an area that you're interested in, let's just say the Big Island of Hawaii. You have recent aerial or satellite imagery. Increasingly, it's very, very good. And you lay a hexagon, hex, we call it, grid over that landscape. And a interpretation expert goes over those hexes and looks where those corners of the hexagons hit forested, or at least photo interpreted forested or non-forested land types. And then that's how that initial plot grid is generated. Of course, these plots are visited and they're determined to be actually forested or not. That's part of the data. Especially in the Pacific Islands, where we have a pretty intense topographic and vegetation kind of range of habitat types. Sometimes that density of the plot network is just way too coarse, and we realize that we need to add more plots, and that's called intensification. That was recently done for Hawaii. It's been very recently done for American Samoa, and it's something that's kind of always sort of ongoing. It also just happened for Alaska. So of course, the counterpoint of that is the more plot density you have, the more staff and labor and analysis time it takes. So it's always a trade-off. Let's talk about the measurement elements real quick. So within those subplots and microplots that I was talking about, we're interested in forest structure composition and disturbance. Those are kind of broadly called condition. We want to know if it's forested. I mentioned that previously. What kind of forest is it? Is there a stand size that we can measure? What kind of regeneration is occurring? We want to have a sense of the percent canopy cover, the trees and sapling density. In addition to density, though, we want to know what species they are, whether they're native, non-native, or just in general what they are. We're interested in standing dead. That has a lot to do with estimating carbon across the landscape, and downwoody materials for the same reason. So vegetation profile, I mentioned that earlier with sort of that cistern example. We want to know if you cut through the forest and create layers, we want to know at these different intervals sort of what's going on by species, by density of the canopy, just get a sense kind of three-dimensionally of what the forest is doing in that area. And I mentioned soils. We'll be talking today about some of our above ground carbon data, but there is a significant component of below ground carbon that's captured in soil cores. So we'll go into that more later. Oh, and then finally, pathology. So we also do take soil samples in Hawaii specifically for Laupähoehoe HETF. And that's sort of on a per plot basis. Is there rot or is there not? We'll go into that more in a bit. But to sort of go a little narrower, FIA is a program, like I said, occurs across the entire country, but specifically me and Ashley and the team that I mentioned, we work for Pacific Islands Forest Inventory, and that manages this project in Hawaii, Guam, American Samoa, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and the US affiliated Pacific Islands nations, Republic of Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And this is a vast area of the Pacific Basin with very differing culture and topography and vegetation communities. So it's great that we have a project that can try to capture this. So FIA in Hawaii, I mentioned previously that our first inventory was 2010 to 2015. Our second inventory was 2019 to 2020. So those are sort of two data points in temporal scale. And you can see on this map that their density is pretty high. Specifically, you can sort of see the Hilo area on the east side of the Big Island. We have a lot of plots. And these are measured on a 10-year cycle. So a lot of these plots are measured in 2010, 2015. They were just remeasured, and then 2029 we'll be measuring them again. So, and I mentioned effort. So we, it's a challenge to get access to land, and we were really successful at that, considering Hawaii's complexity. We were able to get to 81% of our plots. About 13% were access denied, and then 5% were deemed hazardous, which is kind of a multifaceted thing, but it basically just means that the crew can't safely read that plot. And I just want to shout out to DOFA and University of Hawaii that this project wouldn't be possible without them in Hawaii. And also much of our staff was directly or partly funded through those agencies. So thanks to them. So since we're talking about HETF today, just real quick, it's on Pu'u is on the Kona side of the Big Island, and Laupähoehoe is on the northeast Hamakua coast of East Hawaii. And you can sort of see these maps here. It's a pretty vast area. It's 51,000 acres, and there's a lot of goals in HETF. A lot of scientists work there. Generally, we're trying to improve our understanding of species and habitat dynamics, ecological restoration, hydrology is a big one. And it's a living laboratory, so we're enabling long-term research and monitoring, and it has a side goal of advancing our collaboration with the state agencies and other federal agencies that I haven't mentioned. So it's a great place to work. So we talked about intensification. So previously in 2010, 2015, we had a pretty dense grid in HETF, 32 plots in Laupähoehoe and 38 in Pu'u. Those were measured in that cycle. And they were measured again in 2015 by Flint Hughes Lab for the koa moth outbreak that was occurring at the time. This density of plots, however, was not read in 2019 and through 2022 because of a lack of funding. We have a base grid that was read, and I'll show you a map of that. Much coarser though. In 2019, 2022, we read 5 plots in Laupähoehoe, but across a wide elevational gradient, which is important. 4 of them were visited and 1 of them was hazardous. The highest plot there is at about 6,000 feet or so, and the lowest plot is at about 2,600. So it's a pretty broad area. Data. So in Laupähoehoe, there's all kinds of data that we collect. I'm only going to share a small sample of it today, but one of the important measurement parameters in forestry is basal area, and FIA has a cutoff in terms of what we call trees, and in this case, it's 5-inch or greater diameter or larger. And you can see across the elevation there that there's kind of a range of species presence and basal area in terms of square feet per acre. And like in our low elevation plot there, you can see that Pu'u is pretty prevalent, which is great for a low elevation plot. So is Ohia. And at a higher elevation, the 6,090 feet plot, Ohia is dominant, which is really cool. So this is one of the kinds of data we produce. We also have information about seedlings and saplings within that area. Just to clarify, saplings are 1 inch to 4.9 inch diameter. Seedlings are less than 1 inch. And you can see at the low elevation plot, even though the canopy is broadly native, the understory, or at least the seedlings and saplings, are mostly strawberry guava, which is not a surprise having been to that area. And then in the middle elevations, it becomes a little bit more varied. Our 4,000 foot plot is predominantly Pu'u, which is really cool. And then our higher elevation plot, the forest really thins out. So we're only left with 2 natives, but at a very low seedlings and saplings per square acre. I mentioned that sort of layer cake. So we have vegetation structure data. And if I look at this with you, the bottom of the y-axis is layer 1. That's 0 to 2 feet. Layer 2 is 2 to 6. Layer 3 is 6 to 16. And so on and so forth. And if you think about standing in the forest and you're looking up through the canopy, this gives you sort of a 3-dimensional idea of what proportion of that vegetation structure is trees, shrubs, woody vines, forbs, and grasses. So you can see at the high elevation plot, there's a lot of grass component of the vegetation structure, and then in the middles and the lows, there's more trees. So again, this varies a lot. It has a lot to do with your plot density of your plot network. It has to do where the plots are located, and it's mostly randomized. But it's still interesting to look at discrete plot data. We'll get into comparisons in a minute. Invasive species present. This is a little easier to interpret. So this is invasive species percent covered by elevation. This is what for our plots in Laupähoehoe. And you can see the 2010 inventory in the white bars. The percent cover decreases with altitude, which is what we'd expect. But the really interesting thing here is that our percent cover went in the wrong direction, basically, with our new data. So percent cover of invasive species, and this is all invasive species in our species list, went up, and especially in the 2,000 to 4,000 foot elevation range. And I'll be answering plenty of questions about this at the end. I can go back to these slides if necessary. Disturbance. So FIA, there's lots of kinds of disturbance. There's wind damage, there's fire. Specifically for HETF and Laupähoehoe, the main source of disturbance is animal damage, in this case, pigs. And it's interesting to see that across an elevation range, specifically 3,000 to 4,000 feet, how much it increased. Especially the fact that that first error bar is separated, so it's very statistically significant. Much increased damage. So we'll look into that more, but it probably has to do with where the plots are located, whether they're on a certain side of the fence or not, and you'd have to look at all that data at the same time to really make sense of it. But it's one way that our FIA data can be used. Like I said, we're interested in carbon, so I'll be sharing our total above ground carbon today. So we have a 2010 on the left, 2019 on the right. Not a significant increase in total above ground live and dead carbon. The change is also not significant, but we're able to produce this data. And I want to emphasize right now that the 2019 through 2022 data is preliminary. It's still being analyzed by our analysis team, and it won't be published until August. So some of these values might change. But this is just examples of the kind of data we can share. So carbon per acre. So rather than the whole parcel, if we look at above ground carbon per acre, this is in tons. It's increased from 2010 to 2019 in the live category. Hasn't changed much in the dead category. This is a picture of Kalena in, we call it matchstick strawberry guava. It's very hard to work in. But having looked at the data, strawberry guava and some of these low elevation plots is a significant part of the biomass. So thought I'd include that picture. So that's Laupähoehoe. I want to talk a quick bit about Pu'u. So similar to the first map I showed, rather than that very intense grid, we have 5 plots. All of these were visited. The lowest elevation plots at like 2,300 feet, and the highest elevation plot in the forest bird sanctuary is at like 4,500 feet. Hugely variable habitat types, land use changes and disturbance across this area. Looking at basal area again, our low elevation plot down by the road is predominantly silk oak, Grevillea robusta, with a little bit of jacaranda thrown in. If you guys have driven down there before, that probably makes sense. Our mid elevation plots are predominantly ohia, and then our high elevation plot in the forest bird sanctuary is predominantly koa. But this is still a pretty low basal area, so it's a pretty thin forest at that elevation, at least where this plot's located. Seedlings and saplings, silk oak at the low elevation. The reason I'm showing the no sap and seed and microplot is that our data is very sensitive to where these are located. And if our microplots in our design don't land in kind of a cutoff of what a seedling or sapling in, and there are those cutoffs up there in diameter. We just don't measure them. So those two elevations don't have sapling and seedling data. But the high elevation, you can see it's mamane and koa, which makes sense. And then vegetation structure again. So I can share this presentation with anyone that's interested. You're looking up through the canopy and you're kind of getting a sense of what that structure is in terms of percentage of trees, shrubs, and forbs. Invasive species cover in Pu'u. Pu'u has a long history of disturbance and varied management. You can see that the invasive species cover has increased at the very low elevation, maybe not as much as Laupähoehoe. And that again just has to do with the way the land is managed and where the plots land. But you can see it's generally an increase between the two time frames. A slight decrease at the 4,000 to 5,000 foot range, and that could just be that plot landed behind a fence or it was recently managed in that 10 years. The primary disturbance again is pigs. Also a pretty significant increase, especially at the 3,000 to 4,000 foot elevation range. Percent pig damage, again, I mean, the y-axis is 0 to 20%, but if you think about an area that's being inventoried, this is an estimate of this whole area. 20% is a pretty big amount of land. So it's sort of informative in that sense. It goes down as you increase in elevation, which is what we expect. Total above ground live and dead carbon, not a significant change in both live or dead. So one thing that we'd, as a team, kind of talked about a lot is this is really dependent on our density of our plot grid, and we, having lost that intensity from our previous inventory cycle, a lot of this is dependent on funding. And if we want a better sense of the changes of parameters like this, we need a denser plot grid and all that comes with that. So carbon per acre, not a significant change, maybe a slight decrease, but I mean, those error bars are overlapping. So that's the data I'm going to share. We produce all kinds of data as a national program. One of the things that we share with landowners that we, both agencies and private landowners, is a landowner report. And this is a per plot, basically report that shows tree condition, disturbance types that we talked about, trees and saplings, and vegetation structure. It also does a kind of an explanation of what FIA is at the end, shows how the grids are laid out, shows how the plots are read. And it's a really important product that we share with landowners. We also have national level data that our Hawaii data is fed into. We have a bunch of websites. We have our inventory database at USDA.gov website that you can download the data from. Right now, this has our 2010 to 2015 data set. Around August, it'll have our 2019 to 2022 data set. We also have some GIS story maps that can show some of these study areas in more detail. And many scientists, both within our program and outside of our program, that use our FIA data produce journals with this data, and we also produce a lot of general technical reports, or GTRs. Specific data requests, or if you're just not entirely sure how to navigate this, you can contact me and or Suzanne Owen at her email address there, and I can share this if anyone wants it. Well, so there's limitations, right? So what are we still working on? Under construction, we have some statisticians right now working on diameter growth models, height diameter models, height growth models. That's like coconut trees, like they get higher, but they don't get wider. All of these models help us better understand changes in biomass and and forest volume over time, which is really what we're all about. And that's sometimes hard, right? When you only have time one and time two. The longer this project goes on, the more trend information can be pulled out of it. We produce summary tables, which are kind of like the landowner reports, but they're more in depth. They can show scatter plots and other types of graphs that, kind of like some of the ones I showed in this presentation, can show you changes in specific parameters over time. And then finally, one of our big pieces of data that we're working on right now is below ground carbon soil data. So all that soil has been collected, but it's being analyzed within our research and analysis shop, so that data can be available again by August. So I want to thank you all for being here. Suzanne Owen, who's on this call, was a huge help in preparing a lot of the data for this presentation. I want to call out Kalena, Tish, and Rico by name. This project wouldn't have been possible without them. Our mainland data collection team, Ashley, Olaf on our analysis team, and then finally HETF, Tabby, Susan, and Olivia. We couldn't do work in HETF if you guys didn't help us with the logistics and the permitting, so thank you for that. And then finally, since HETF is co-managed with DOFA, our land access process really can't work on the Big Island without close collaboration with DOFA Forestry and the Natural Area Reserve System. So we have about 20 minutes for questions and answer, and I'm probably going to loop in some of our other forest inventory staff on some of those answers. Olivia, do you have a structure for that?
If anybody would like to turn their cameras on and turn their mics on, that works that way, or if you put it into the chat, I can read it off the chat. But yeah, for right now, it's just free for all. Unless there's a lot of people who want to go at once, then we can raise their hand, raise your hands. But yeah, feel free to, sorry, my messages are going off, but feel free to speak up.
That was a lot of info, so I'm happy to return to any slide or just theme that anyone's curious about looking at. I wanted to get all that out there so we had time for questions and answers. So.
I was late joining, I'm sorry. I have Zoom issues or couldn't figure it out. The areas you're talking about, are these your dedicated areas for research, or is this actual state land, public land, existing forests?
That's a great question. Yeah. So specifically for Hawaii forest inventory, we have plots across federal, state, private land. And we work closely with all those ownership categories. The plots are distributed, well, they're guided by whether the land looks like it's forested or not forested from satellite imagery, but they're unbiasedly distributed across the entire landscape. So we're not really choosing to put all of our plots on state or federal land or a certain type of land status. We're really curious in seeing what happens to forest structure and dynamics across every management and land use category that you can imagine.
Okay.
I hope that
Follow up. Yeah. With that in mind, what is the, are we working towards, or does the state have in mind restoring the natural watershed, natural native forest to existing watershed and expanding watershed?
So I can't answer that question directly. Forest inventory is looking at existing forest dynamics at these time positions, right? So we had 2010 to 2015 and we have 2019 to 2022. We're not really doing restoration research. We want to know what's there now. And of course, that data can be fed into restoration research and management decisions by those agencies. But the decisions about what's done with that land, whether it's restoration, vegetation management, animal control, is made by those agencies.
Well, I guess the question was directed, are we looking at expanding watershed with the forest?
Flint, could I give that to you? That's kind of an open-ended question that I think you have more context about.
Before we move on, do you mind, John, stop sharing for a second?
Yeah,
so
of course.
We can better see each other, because I know there are a couple of people who want to question. But anyways, keep going.
Is that better?
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Cool. Yep. Yeah, I'd have to direct that question to the Department of Forestry and Wildlife. Can't really make a statement about expansion of forested watersheds. Of course, you know, we want more healthy forested watersheds, but can't comment on management decisions.
So your facility would assist in that, but that's not your thrust.
We look at, a lot of the scientists here look at changes over time and sort of all the kind of parameters you can imagine: water quality, species abundance and presence.
Right.
And we obviously and do share that data with land management agencies.
Right.
So thanks for your question.
I think I saw another hand up, but it was removed. Does that person want to speak?
I should open the chat. I haven't really done that.
Hi, yes. I'm not sure if my question will make sense, but you know, here it goes. From the data that you were able to show us in the different categories of land management that you were also like observing and gathering data about forest canopy and trees, in terms of health, which seemed the best and what land management category was it? In terms of health overall and forest structure?
So a lot of the data I shared today was sort of elevationally based, and the only patterns that I can draw without sort of showing like the fence lines and other management that's like actively going on right now in those areas. The only kind of general trend that I saw was that the low elevation plots in like the 2,000 to 3,000 foot elevation range are mostly, if not all, non-native, with a pretty low diversity of vegetation structure. We kind of have to look at a per plot basis level of data to sort of create more detailed explanations out of that. And the plot grid is pretty low density. So we have to be careful looking at individual discrete plots, and there's only 5, let's say, in Pu'u, about making general statements about that entire parcel. I mean, we have a lot of data that's based on estimates of taking those 5 plots worth of data and kind of putting it across that whole parcel. But the standard error is pretty high. And part of that is that we're just not done in analyzing the data yet. And part of it also is that we just have to be realistic about what our data can capture. So I will say confidently that even though it would be a lot more work, we would really love to have a much denser plot grid. So thanks.
Awesome. I'm going to read a question that Elliot had in the chat. Could FIA data feasibly be used to detect climate change signals? For example, plant species distribution shifts, native or non-native, up and down slope. He says, I know it's tricky for invasives as you don't know if they're expanding due to climate change or if they're spreading to their fullest extent yet. Also a follow-up question, how much funding do you need to do all these plots and how can we help you get funding?
So I can answer the first bubble, I think at least a little bit, and then I'll probably defer the funding question to Ashley or Dan. So our FIA data, again, in the context of it being a low density grid right now, it can show us changes in these sort of 10-year cycles. And like, let's say at this elevation range in time 1, there's a pretty good amount of Laupähoehoe, let's say, just as an example. And then 10 years later, there is much less or none. I mean, is that a weakness in that species? Is that a disturbance problem? Is that a climate change problem? It's kind of hard to say. And I've dealt with this in past work, especially if you're working in an area, or in our case, measuring in an area that has ongoing management. There's a lot of variables in making sort of consistent changes, consistent statements across time. So I think in terms of climate change, the data that's really interesting to me is the above ground and below ground carbon. So that's something that I can share more with you when it's published in August. So Ashley, can you comment on the funding?
Yeah.
Side of it? Thanks.
Also want to give a shout out to Flint Hughes too. He's an integral part of this project and the initial setup and the intensified plots and the experimental forest. So yeah, we did reach out to DOFA in 2019 to see if this is something they could fund as part of this second measurement cycle. And they didn't have funding at the time, but we can continue to work on an overview of what the cost would be to measure those intensified plots.
Awesome. Brian, would you like to?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia, and thanks, Jonathan, for your presentation. Just personally, it really takes me back. Doing FIA plots is where I started my career. Many years ago, fresh out of college. So it's really great to see this work happen. So one question that I had, and this sort of builds on what Frank had asked about, how can this data be used, for the watershed protection, and we know that this year's state budget and the state with all of their priorities are prioritizing watersheds and increasing that, and so yeah, just reaching out, I guess, to representatives is the best way to have the voice heard on that. But my question in particular, when this report comes out, and FIA data is really great when you have it combined, and you can see these trends taking place over time, which is really wonderful. I know there's some limitations about when you start getting into specific areas because of the confidentiality of these plot locations. One, I would be curious to know how far this data can be broken down into like regionally or in specific areas. And just a little further backstory on that, just, say the state, for example, was like really prioritizing a certain watershed, a certain area on a certain island, and was like, hey, we want to know what information you have in this particular area, how available and how specific can you all get with with that analysis? And then I'll have one follow-up question after you answer that.
I think I can answer part of this. Dan and Ashley might need to speak up, but we've done, I mentioned intensification before, where we've increased the density. Sometimes that's done across the entire landscape, like has been done on the Big Island, but that's still our base grid. If there's a specific area, let's just say Laupähoehoe and HETF, where we want an increase in plot density, they already exist. I showed that first map, but let's just say they didn't. We would go back to sort of step one with those photo interpretation guys and gals, and we would lay new hexes across that landscape. Actually, they might be the original hexes. Dan, you can comment on that, but more would be placed, and that increased grid would be used to make kind of more confident statements. But that data doesn't exist for time one, so now you sort of have a new start time. So you can make comparisons, but again, you need time to pass before you start having more ability to compare across. Yeah, and if there was an interest from the state to increase plot density in a specific area, I'm sure if I could accommodate it, it'd be a process, but I know it could be done. Yeah.
And Brian, Suzanne, I think, is on the call. She deals with different types of data requests that come in, like the one that you're mentioning, and like for this presentation, I think some of this was based off of kind of a few plots, some of these figures and stuff. So she is able to narrow it down to a specific area. Depending on, sometimes we might not have plots in certain watersheds, or like John was saying, we may only have one. And in that case, like, is that really representative and going to give us much information, or the type of information the state would be looking for on that?
So yeah, I want to reiterate one of while intensification can and has occurred, one of the things that we avoid is creating a bias unintentionally, where we let's say there's a really nice piece of habitat within Laupähoehoe and we wanted to put a plot like there. Like that wouldn't really follow the protocol. I mean, we could definitely look at that parcel and place more plots across the landscape, but we want to avoid kind of intentionally citing plots based on what we think is like nice, because that introduces bias, and we want this across time to be an unbiased study. So.
Yeah, thanks. Those were great answers, and I really appreciate that. And of course, yeah, that's what the FIA program is about, having this unbiased, just look at what's going on. That said, FIA Plots, they've been going for a long time, and it's really, really good plot design, a really good monitoring design. So I guess a follow-up question would be for, either a land manager or an agency who who really wanted to, you know, take a closer look at a particular parcel or so forth, and you know, wanted to have you know, maybe not so random, maybe get in there and be like, hey, we want to plot, you know, in the middle of the Valley of the Giants, for example. You know, we want to make sure that's in there, so we're capturing that, you know, if we're talking Laupähoehoe. But so would it be more, you know, impactful, or I don't know, would it be more recommended to, you know, reach out to you all and try to get you all more funding to, you know, increase that intensity? Or is there an avenue to, you know, help, you know, whatever organization, you know, get support for like plot design and so to speak, to, you know, have an organization or agency create that network on this, you know, a targeted piece of land, you know, so it's outside of the FIA, but really taking in, you know, this, you know, really great methodology.
Yeah, Ashley, you can correct me if I'm wrong. With existing data, there's restrictions, but I don't believe there's anything keeping someone else from using our survey design. If Hakalau or Park Service wanted to do, and I know there's already existing survey designs for those agencies, but if they wanted to, let's say, use our survey design in an area that we just don't have an FIA plot that lands there, I don't think there's anything that prevents them from doing that. Like you said, it matters where that data ends up for sure. But yeah, that could be done. Tom, I see you have your hand raised. Could you? I'll go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to help too. I mean, there is examples across the nation where different states have like sort of done a different type of modified design and have consulted with FIA or have not, but have also compared the data with the FIA data set. And a great example of that is in Palau. You know, they have implemented a national forest inventory where they have modified the FIA design and intensified the plots and have just one subplot to look at what's going on with their management and conservation efforts across each state. So, so yeah, there's some great examples out there of how people have worked with the FIA program on those types of studies.
Cool,
thanks, Ashley. Hey, Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, kind of an in-between question. So not knowing where all the Hakalau plots are, and I don't think you guys have any over on Kona unit, but could you be funded to do, like if you had 20 plots on Hakalau and you only did 3 in this last go around, and we're still within kind of a similar window, right? Could you be funded to just go and do those additional plots? Or would that introduce some kind of weird bias to the overall analysis?
I'll have to give that one to Ashley or Dan. It's a great question.
So for the inventory that just wrapped up, it probably, yeah, we would be talking about what opportunities there are for the next visit. Yeah, as we plan to come back to Hawaii in a few years, yeah, on the next cycle. But certainly a conversation worth having if there's stakeholder interest in particular areas, and particularly if there's, you know, funding for intensification from stakeholders with an interest, you know, that's like a, yeah, definitely a worthwhile conversation to have early.
Yeah, wish I would have known that, because that could have been, you know, some cheap additional data for us. So yeah, definitely keep that in mind in the future.
Elliot, I haven't forgotten about you. Looks like Suzanne partly answered that, but Elliot asked, can your data be broken down to inside and outside ungulate exclusion fences? And the answer is yes. We would want to look at where those fences are in GIS, but I'm almost certain that there's plots in managed areas and out of managed areas. And then you said also for PWW, invasive species cover increased, but it looked like error bars overlapped. Were statistics done to look for significant differences? And yeah, the answer to that is that we're still doing the stats. It's not done yet. Those initial exports that I shared today that Suzanne produced are, yeah, they're still a really early days product. So we're happy to share that data with you when it's all finalized in August. In fact, we will. I mean, I have, that's on one of my many to-do lists to send that out when August rolls around. So I don't see, if I missed a question in chat, please speak up now. I don't want to miss anybody.
It is almost 1 o'clock, so I also just want to say we have time for one more question, but if any of the people involved today want to share their emails with me, I can put that in the follow-up email. So if any of us have follow-up questions, I mean, I'm sure we all, know how to find these people, but if, yeah, you can give the emails to me and I can send them out to everyone. But yeah, we do have time for one more question if anybody has one. If that's it, you can say a couple closings. John, did you want to say anything?
Just that, yeah, the data will be available in August. We'll be sharing that with a lot of these agencies and landowners at that time. That data will look in its basic form, like that landowner report that I sent, or sorry, that I showed on one of the slides, but we can produce more detailed types of data in summary report form, plus what just appears in the publication at the end to landowners by request. So what I showed today is sort of barely scratching the surface. We just wanted to share some of the stuff that we had available.
Sorry, question.
Yeah.
Will we have access to this data?
Yeah, it's publicly funded and it's publicly available in August.
We can do that through the emails and all that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you.
Awesome.